We are back on the Zero Hour. I, as always, am your host, Richard RJ Eskow. New reports say that the poverty rate actually fell in the United States during the pandemic as a result of government programs. It turns out that giving people money reduces poverty. Who knew? Who could have guessed? Here to discuss that and other topics with me is my regular guest, economist Richard Wolff. You know all about him, that he has a program Tuesday evenings on Free Speech TV, Economic Update, as well as a podcast of the same name, that he's professor emeritus at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst, as well as visiting professor at New York University, and the author of a number of books, latest of which is "The Sickness is the System." And without further ado, Richard Wolff, welcome back to the program.
Thank you, RJ. Glad to be here and glad to be talking with you.
And glad to have you as always. And, do you share in the general sense of surprise that's been expressed in the mainstream media that giving people money might make them somewhat less poor? This strikes me as sort of a fundamental, not a brain twister at all, but I have seen a certain amount of astonishment expressed in certain circles about this outcome. What should we think of that?
Well, I was reminded when I saw those headlines of what I believe is attributed to F. Scott Fitzgerald. And when asked the deep question, what distinguishes us from rich people? He said, oh, yes, they're very different. One of them has more money than the other one.
Right.
The idea that your relative wealth is in some sense a measure of your just deserts, the reward to your activity, the merit you bring. I'm an academic. I live in a world in which my colleagues take the notion of merit dreadfully seriously. And I use the word dreadfully because it is dreadful. It is a horrific self-mutilation, this idea. The notion that you are what you are because, for example, you have this or that virtue or this or that skill. If you study other languages, you'll know that the following phrase doesn't exist in them. I recently did an interview with a Brazilian television, and the announcer, hearing me say something, stopped the conversation and said, in Portuguese, which is the language they speak down there is no phrase such as the self-made man. It doesn't. If they want to explain, if they want to translate, for example, my use of it, they have to go through an elaborate network of sentences to get the very idea across to an audience, which typically starts laughing at the proposition. I mean, anybody, even with the smallest smattering of psychology or just observing life, understands that we are all of the people with whom we have interacted in our lives, mommy and daddy and relatives and neighbors and friends and teachers and ministers and on and on and on. The notion that I am a self-made man, that I literally made myself, is intellectually as empty as it is biologically utterly nonsensical. But merit is the attempt to organize, to ritualize this idea. And I can't tell you the number of times I've had to sit in a seminar room with my colleagues, wherever I happen to have been teaching at the time, and we're discussing whether to publish something, or we're discussing whether to hire someone to be a professor and to join us. And we sit around stroking our respective chins, discussing his or her merit, as if that was something. I'm reminded of the medieval debates about how many angels could dance or fit on the head of a pin, since angels have no dimensions and the head of the pin, however small, has some. This is an interesting, if also empty, conversation. So is merit. Nothing is more obvious than that when you hire someone and you attribute to them merit, you do so on the basis of the slimmest of evidence. The vast majority of relevant evidence you cannot know, which means whatever the word merit might encompass, it's a mystery and it will unravel itself across the rest of your and the target's lifetimes. In other words, it's empty. There is no such thing that makes any sense to me, but it has a social function. And here we get to your poverty point. The social function is to blame the situation of individuals on themselves. It is to tell the person who doesn't get the job teaching, not that huge areas of his or her competence were never explored, never discovered, never evaluated, which would have taken months or years anyway. So that's why it's an empty exercise, can't be done, never has been done. But it means that you're made to feel that you didn't get that job because you don't have merit. You know, the afternoon after you're told this is a very difficult afternoon. And for many people, it lasts the rest of their lives. And their next visit is to the bar, or their next visit is to some self-destructive psychological activity as they go through a punishment for their failure. I mean, it is horrible. And finally, what it does is it distracts human beings from social criticism. They don't. Well, what in the world is going on here? Why should I submit 4 pieces of paper which list some information and have these strangers sit around, look at the 4 pieces of paper, and decide my merit? I mean, it's an insult. It's outrageous behavior. And the minute you display it for people, they kind of get it. But we live in a culture that suffuses. You know, I have a good time with this, RJ, because I'm the product of elite American schools. I don't know if I ever told you, I probably did, but I went to Harvard as an undergraduate. Then I went to Stanford for my next degree, and my PhD is at Yale. It's like a joke. So I'm a walking emblem of elite education. I have tried over the years many times to explain to people that Harvard, Stanford, and Yale, nothing goes on there that is in any way extraordinary, unusual, brilliant, or anything else. It's very mundane. Often it is really low quality education, et cetera, et cetera. I have an easier time criticizing capitalism, criticizing epistemology, than getting an American audience to actually begin to think that the hype is just hype. You know, that when you buy a bar of soap that's advertised on TV with the remark, if you just use this soap every day in the shower, your sex life will improve 100 times. But when you say that, people giggle because they know that that's bullshit. Pardon my Spanish. They know, and they know that the purpose is ulterior, namely to get money out of your wallet, so you buy that brand of soap. Well, when Harvard spends, as it does, as Stanford does, as Yale does, huge amounts of money to pump up its reputation, if you believe the hype that they put out, then you're the kind of person who is looking for a major improvement in your sex life if you only use that soap instead of the other soap. It's an amazing thing, but it is, you know, and it speaks to poverty. You know, countless people will tell you if you're poor and you can get some money, you can then do the things you couldn't do when you were poor, which lifts your quality of life, which lifts your spirit, which lifts your sense of yourself, making all kinds of changes possible. It's the height of cruelty to deny this to people. And all we saw in the last year and a half, particularly, and I really want to stress this, the extra $300 a week for the unemployed, basically, that program. That's what did it. That's what suddenly made people who are in and out of the pool of unemployed people, they have a job for a while. Because they've been unemployed, the jobs they can get are lousy in most cases, or low pay, insecure, impermanent, et cetera, et cetera. So they're back on the unemployed. These people cannot accumulate the savings without which you cannot survive. And that's why they're in this situation. You suddenly give them, for a period of months, $300 extra a week, which, if you know how wealth works in America, is pocket change for wealthy people. It can transform their lives. And the real lesson to be taken from it is, if you go to the really rich, the top 10%, and you take from them $300 a week for 6 months, it will not change their lives in an appreciable way. But you give that to the people at the bottom, it's transformative. And then I leave it to everybody's ethics and morality or religion to say whether it is justified not to do that, given what you can achieve.
I have a number of thoughts. Yeah, there was so much there, Richard Wolff, that I want to share a couple of them anyway. One is this phrase "self-made man," which is so fascinating the more you think of it. It's like a Zen koan or something when you start to think about it. First of all, how is this possible? Secondly, if you have traditional values, it's an affront to God, it's an affront to your mother and father, it's an affront, the height of hubris, right? I'm a self-made man. I literally generated myself. And it also made me think of the phrase lifting yourself up by your bootstraps, which is another, equally popular one in the same circles, a physical and mechanical impossibility. Right. It is absolutely impossible to pull your bootstraps in such a way that you are elevated off the ground. And yet this is the stated ambition millions of children in this country are still inculcated with, right? You need to lift yourself up by your own bootstraps. You need to levitate in order to survive in this society. So it just speaks to how words and framing shape our view of our role in the economy and our willingness to submit to the profound cruelty to which so many working people in this country are subjected on a daily basis, whether they're currently working or whether they're unemployed. This fractionization of, you're on your own. If you don't create yourself, you won't exist. If you don't pull yourself up in a superhuman and, paraphysical way, you won't, elevate your station in life. And to me, it speaks to such a deep impoverishment of the spirit that, looping back to our original topic of the report, giving people money elevates them out of poverty, you don't even consider that as a possible option for your society because, well, they're supposed to levitate and generate themselves out of nothingness, and they haven't done that. So what will a few $100 do if you can't defy the laws of the universe? So I guess I'm being a little bit flippant, but this is really, it's a serious topic,
Very
right?
serious.
It's how we are internalizing an oppressive system instead of, it's the mind forged manacles, as William Blake would say. How do we break those as a society? Recognize it's all, to use your phrase, and Troy will have to bleep it out again, bullshit, and say, that we've got to stop thinking these mystical, magical hypnotizing thoughts and act collectively for ourselves. Do you get what I'm driving at?
Yes, and I think here's an illustration. I don't know at this point how many there were. I think there were about 20 governors, Republican governors, before that program ended anyway, but which, by the way, Mr. Biden permitted to happen and didn't have to. That's a whole nother conversation. But even before it lapsed by the law that it was as it was written, 20 Republican governors took their power and ended the $300 extra before they had to. In other words, even though the federal government funded the bill, they chose to take it away. Now, the real reason, which if you read the financial press was obvious, namely, by taking it away, the hope was that those people would now be so desperate, minus
Right.
the 300, that they would go back to work. And their assessment of not wanting to get COVID would be overwhelmed by their desperation, since the $300 a week from these poor people was taken away. I always wonder sort of how your discussion with the God, if you believe in that, on Sunday, how it works if you took away the 300 from poor people. It's literally like you went down where the beggars were lined up and removed whatever they had gotten into their handkerchief earlier that day. But anyway, put that aside. Here was the interesting thing to me. A number of the governors said, by taking away the money, we are doing these people a favor. Now, hear me, because this is the same ideology taken to the next illogical step. Namely, you see, if you get the $300, well, then you don't work for it. You
Right.
don't have to work for it. You don't have to make yourself something. And so you atrophy. You lose whatever you might have had in the way of merit, because you're now getting something for nothing. And this is not good for your mental health. It's a little bit like what the parents used to say when they were confronted about beating their children, that they were beating into them something that these children would cherish for the rest of their lives. And you had to sort of slow down, take a deep breath, and realize what certain kinds of ideology can rationalize human beings doing. It's extraordinary. If I take money away, make the lives of these poor people this much harder, I am doing them a service. At that point, you can understand fascism. You don't want to give anybody anything. And you can convince yourself, I'm not going to tax the rich in order to help the mass of people, because it's not good for the mass of people. It's a side effect that it's not good, that it's good for the rich, that I don't tax them. But by not taxing the rich, I am doing a service for the poor. It becomes what, Huxley would have enjoyed as a kind of new speak. It's an ability to rationalize inequality as a favor done to its victims. It's an extraordinary step. And I remember, if I can say one last thing about it, a year or so ago, I happened to be watching the internet, and there was a picture of the Spanish Parliament. And a bill had been introduced to take away an enormous share of the social welfare, which is a big deal in Spain, because it's like most other European countries. They have a fairly generous safety net. And the conservatives on one side of the chamber stood up and applauded with an intensity that I'm reminded of from the pictures of Nuremberg, the rallies, Hitler's rally. They wanted to make the poor poorer. It was a deep emotional excitement. They had convinced themselves that Spain's success as a nation required taking away from the lower half of the population a handful of supports that are given to people in Spain. And it wasn't just that what they were doing was awful. I'll never forget the look on their face. And it came back to me when I saw pictures of a couple of those Republican governors getting into a speech in which they were doing a favor to the people from whom they were taking $300. And that was to the applause of people who fight like cats and dogs to get a bigger increase in their salary wherever they work. It's as if their employer would say, look, Fred, I know you want an increase in salary, but I'm not going to give it to you. And that's for your own good.
Right.
You'll work harder now because I'm not getting, in fact, I'm going to take away 20% of your salary because wow, will you work? I mean, Fred would blow up if this were ever done to him.
And just to keep the conversation appropriately bipartisan, since that's the fashion these days, it also reminds me of a Democratic Senator, Kristen Sinema, doing a little victory dance when she cast the deciding vote. I believe it was killing the minimum wage increase to a pathetically paltry $15 an hour, but this was too generous, and she felt that was a moment. I believe that was the vote where she did a little victory gesture. You know, this notion that I mean, the barbarity and cruelty of it is unimaginable, unless you think about as I know you do for a living, basically, but unless you think about the fact that this all seems to me to be almost an irreversible entropic process of capitalist economy and psychology. In other words, what I mean by that is once you start thinking like that, it's just what you described. If cutting your income is doing you a favor, then isn't eliminating your income doing you an even bigger favor? And if not increasing the minimum wage is for your own good, then isn't eliminating the minimum wage for your own good? And isn't it just coincidental that that's just wonderful for the capitalist and investor class and employer class, that now when you're hungry enough, when you're desperate enough, when your children are dying, you won't even ask for $7.25 an hour. You'll take 25 cents an hour if that's all that's there. So isn't this all, I mean, it feels like a singularity, you know, where black hole gets to the stage that it just starts swallowing everything around it, and there's no stopping it until it exhausts all the matter around it. You get the analogy? I mean, it just feels like we're getting sucked into a vortex of something.
And I think we're already there. I think you and I even spoke about this a week or two ago. The same country that is taking away the $300 a week from the poorest of its people sits mesmerized as two billionaires throw vast amounts of money into a contest between them about who can sit for a few minutes in a rocket ship. And we admire, because they have tens, or in Bezos's case, hundreds of billions of dollars. This is of no importance as a financial cost. And we are therefore trained to admire what they are doing and not to ask the question that if he had not done that, the money to enable millions of people to get an extra $300 a week would have been paid for. Conversation closed. No. It's reasonable that he has a $1 billion toy, and for those people now to literally have to go back to work in an unsafe workplace, risking their lives, of course, not just of them, but of all their family and friends, neighbors, and all of that, because they can't live without the $300 extra a week, which, by the way, was justified when it was passed as helping people through a pandemic that we all know is still here. So, I mean, the pandemic isn't gone. What are you doing? None of those things matter, because this ideology of merit, of the self-made person, that capitalism is a system that rewards you in proportion to the work you contribute. This is spectacular as an ideology. You know, in economics, we teach this junk.
And yes, yeah, I know. The and I say if we can send two billionaires into space, why not send them all?
Oh,
But I wanted to go back. I'm glad you reminded me of the merit discussion because I also wanted to go back to this. It seemed to me analogous in another way too. That this process of members of a faculty department sitting around judging the merit of applicants, because to me, what I was thinking when you were talking about this is remember those old two-stroke engines for like lawnmowers where you had to pour in some water and some gasoline, you had to get the balance right, and then they'd go. Well, when it comes to the lawnmower, water has no merit without gasoline. Gasoline has no merit without water. Neither of them will power the lawnmower. You'd think of faculty department, we think of, that as a group of enlightened persons. I know you're in academia, so you know how false that impression is, but that is the perception. And you would think a group of enlightened people would not think, is this applicant's merit thus high or thus low as an individual participant in this competitive foot race for survival? You would think it would be, well, how do they complement? How will they work with us? What will the synergistic effect of all of us together be? But it's not. It's who is more compliant in fighting for the best GPA, and before that for the best SAT scores, and it strikes me that that too is a failure to think collectively rather than as an atomized set of individuals judging another individual on how high they can jump or how low they can do a limbo or whatever it is. But do you got what I'm driving at there in terms
yes,
of collective thinking?
but that's the power of ideology. And I'm always humbled as I get yet another illustration of the power of ideology. For me, it was Gramsci as a Marxist theorist who was so powerful in teaching us because of his effort to make a revolution in Italy, in the north of Italy, when he mobilized the Fiat workers in Torino, and he couldn't pull it off. And he couldn't pull it off, not because they weren't oppressed, they were, not because they weren't militant, they were, but they were also the product of 500 years of the Roman Catholic Church, of Italian politics, of Italian culture, and on and on. And those issues stood in the way, and they had to be confronted, which is what he did in the rest of his life in such a brilliant way. And I see it all. I see it all the time. The same faculty that sit there evaluating someone else's merit. We then had this problem. I don't mind telling you. The university, cleverly dividing the naive professors, would give us our merit pay each year in the following two forms. Everybody got, like, say, 2% increase. And then a lump sum was given to the department to allocate itself among itself according to merit. We had 28 people in our department. A committee was set up of 3, and the 3 decided on the merit of everybody else, including themselves, in order to distribute a few extra $100 this way or that way. Lifetime friendships dissolved when this committee of 3 gave John a bit more money than Louise, or Harriet got a bit more than Fred. And they were outraged, they were deeply hurt, but they learned nothing. The next time a person came from outside, they treated them in a roughshod, cold, uncaring manner, as if they hadn't sulked for 6 years when they were given $300 less a year than the next professor in the next office. And the childishness. On the one hand, the power of the ideology. On the other hand, how thin it is. If you had a sustained attack on that ideology, I think it would be defeated. But we don't have social forces in this country able and willing to mount the kind of ideological attack. I see it myself every time I go on television to more center or right wing, which, by the way, are increasingly inviting me for whatever weird reason in our
No,
culture.
that's great.
Oh,
Yeah.
it is, and but I can see with them how they react. They're more upset with the critique of meritocracy than they are with advocacy of socialism. I mean, that's how deep this
Uh-huh.
ideology works.
It's so fascinating, and this is I mean, we could talk about this forever, and as you know, by the way, speaking of Gramsci, that among other things, the Marxist historian Eric Hobsbawm wrote great things about the history of that Italian culture that he was operating in. But maybe I'll quote with or close with, my motto comes from Gramsci, which is pessimism of the intellect, optimism of the will.
Oh, that's right.
I'm not sure. I mean, I'll give you the last word. I'm not sure that I even feel as much pessimism of the intellect as I used to feel. I think my intellect is aligning itself more with my will in the sense that, and we've talked about this many times, but in the sense that I think in the midst of all this pain and stress, that opportunities may be opening up for real change. But I'll give you the last word. So.
That might be a topic we agree to spend some time on. I have been feeling the last few weeks a level of, I don't know what the word is, distress, sadness, grimness on the left, that as I encounter it, just haphazardly. And I keep wondering why that is, because, I mean, I understand what the events are that provoke it, but I, like you, I have a sense on the other side of openings and opportunities. I mean, I hope it's okay to mention, but last night I did a program for the Miami, Florida DSA, Democratic Socialists
Mhm.
of America. You know, for me to talk, for my wife to talk, we spent an hour and a half with the 90 people that signed up to have a discussion about the future of socialism in America in Miami, Florida. Okay, that's a good sign.
Mhm.
DSA is able to do this all over the place. And I'm not for or against DSA. It has nothing to do with that. I'm appreciative that they are a way that people are getting together, talking about this material, talking to each other about these ways of things. So I see movement of all kinds, and I also see, which is another topic, but I think it's becoming more urgent, RJ. So I would urge you to think about it: the fracturing of the old capitalist West is
Mhm.
gathering speed in a way that I find amazing. Today's headline, in which the United States, without consultation, drops a bomb on the French by creating a nuclear submarine fleet in China with Australia. I mean, what? What? I mean, if you have to do that, it's bad enough. But you don't work it out with the French, your allies. You've just finished coming off alienating the Germans because of the Nord Stream gas pipeline they have with Russia. I mean, you're forcing Europe to become a third force in a way that will cost you way more than the rigidly authoritarian Australian government could possibly be worth to anyone, even the Australians. It's extraordinary. And the British, this is a competition. Who's going to be the American poodle? I mean, in which they're all running to be number one. But everything is literally changing very, very fast.
Maybe that can be our next topic, the fracturing of the American West. And as for the despair on the left, well, that's another topic too. But I think the left has gotten over focused on incremental changes in Congress and is losing the inspirational vision that has given it so much energy in the last several years. So that's also a topic for
All
another
right.
day. But
Absolutely. Absolutely.
as always, Richard Wolff, we have much, much, much to talk about. And as always, I get so much out of these conversations. So thank you for coming on the program.
Thank you, RJ, and I look forward to our next one.
As do I. And we'll be right back after this. I'm Richard RJ Eskow, and this is the Zero Hour.